Tunley a single Black Death. The other ships are anchored beyond the Worsted Archipelago's confines because they're afraid of being discovered. This is good news. Klein retracted his gaze and deliberately bit his lip to express his agitation. After taking a glance at Helene's side profile, Mither lit a torch and began swinging it to signal to the flagship. Before long, a dinghy came and took him and the disguised Klein back to the Black Death. As the dinghy was being hoisted up, Klein boarded another pirate admiral's flagship. Under Mither's lead, he entered the cabin. Waiting for them up ahead was a blonde female attendant. She glanced at Helene with a cold stare before pointing sideways to the room. Go in. This attitude. It's like meeting a love rival in the flesh. Both men and women fall to this Vice Admiral Ailment's charm. The cuffed Klein instantly increased his vigilance as he wore a heavy expression and followed the blonde female attendant into the room. He originally believed that he would immediately meet Tracy and obtain a chance to meet her in private. He was already ready to strike, but apart from a wardrobe, sofa, and full-body mirror in a cramped carpeted room, there was nothing. Could it be that Tracy has deliberately given Helene the cold shoulder to express her anger? Klein recalled the romance novels and contrived television serials he had previously watched while contemplating the reason for the ailment maiden's actions. The blonde female attendant shot a glance at Helene's male attire that lacked the androgynous beauty to it due to the lack of makeup, took 2 quick steps, opened the wardrobe, and pointed to the dresses inside. Captain doesn't like your present attire. Change. F***K, Klein cursed inwardly. He originally imagined that he could be granted a meeting with Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy while looking like Helene and dressed as a male. He was thankful that he didn't need to overly humiliate himself to achieve his goal, but in the end, he didn't manage to escape this outcome that he wanted to avoid. Seeing Helene standing there in a daze, the blonde female attendant glared at her. You have 2 choices. Either you change yourself, or I'll help you. Klein did one of red-haired Helene's habitual motions and inhaled slightly. Remove my cuffs. He turned his body sideways and gestured with his chin towards the door. And go outside. Conniving whore. The blonde female attendant cursed under her breath and used the key given to her by Mither to release Helene from her cuffs. After she left the room and closed the door, Klein walked to the wardrobe and stood there in a daze for 20 seconds. Suddenly, he closed his eyes and extended his right hand. After an unknown period of time, he came in front of the full-body mirror and saw Helene's red hair cascading down in the reflection. Her green eyes shimmered while she wore a golden-red dress. By her waist was a ribbon tied into a flower. It was pulled tight, accentuating her slender waist. Helene's beautiful face was flushed red as her lips were tightly pursed. Her expression was heavy, looking very identical to the picture from before. Klein looked at his present image and first felt somewhat embarrassed. However, he had gotten over it to a certain extent while changing. Besides, there wasn't anyone inside. Second, he gradually found a different feeling. This wasn't to say that he was gradually liking such acts. Instead, while overcoming his mental aversion, he gained some form of detachment from his self-awareness. It felt like his soul had flown out of his body, allowing him to calmly observe Helene dressing up in female attire and adjusting her clothes through the mirror with a calm attitude. He believed this was a necessary step in his mission and that there was nothing embarrassing or odd about this. Klein felt a baffling sense of familiarity as he tried hard to recall and compare this feeling, in a bid to fix it in place and gain an understanding of it. Soon, he found the source. This was similar to him playing role-playing games. In it, he could choose a female character, carefully choosing the facial features and attire of the character, allowing the beauty to please his eyes. There was nothing kinky or embarrassing while doing this. On the one hand, he was viewing it from an angle of a god through the screen, making his attitude detached, and on the other hand, he was seriously acting and going through the plot by combining the two perfectly and not distinguishing between them. He didn't have any aversion to it because he was playing a game. This. Klein suddenly opened his half-closed eyes, feeling like this was the faceless state he had been searching for. He could act as anyone, but he was still only himself. As he got into character and worked hard to act, he could detach his feelings and observe things calmly. By making comparisons, he could figure himself out and find his true self. It's both getting into character and detachment. This is the actual application of the faceless main principle. Klein suddenly felt at peace as the remnant embarrassment coexisted with his changed attitude. With a detached attitude, as though he was playing a role-playing game, he observed himself in the full-body mirror and tried hard to find any flaws. Thankfully, I got Danitz to get 2 sets of female clothing to study the way it's all put together. Otherwise, there's no way I could wear them so quickly and normally as a first-timer. It will be easy to expose any flaws. This is called professionalism. Women's clothing sure is complicated. From the perspective of a faceless, there are many flaws in Helene's facial features and contours. She might be beautiful, but it's definitely nothing I call stunning. Yes, with this state of mind, I can clearly feel the potion digesting. Klein looked at himself in the mirror as though he was looking at a character named Helene. Thump. 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 The blonde female attendant banged on the door and asked impatiently, "Are you not done?" Klein's face instantly sank, as though she hadn't returned him the 10,000 pounds she owed him. He maintained this state as he walked to the door and pulled it open. The blonde female attendant shot him a glance and raised the handcuffs. "Put your hands to your back. You're now a prisoner." As red-haired Helene was on the Black Death, she wasn't afraid that she would bring her any harm. All she wanted was to humiliate her as much as she could. Klein grunted and half-turned his body, putting his hands to his back. He felt relaxed because the woman wasn't paying too much attention to his attire. After putting on the cuffs, he was led by the blonde female attendant to the entrance of the captain's cabin. The door was half open, allowing a fragrance of warmth emanate outside. It wasn't too strong, but it was sufficiently long-lasting. It was a scent that kept pulling one back as they would involuntarily wish to head to bed for pleasure. The blonde female attendant knocked on the door and was just about to say a word when a gloomy but sufficiently beautiful female voice sounded from the inside. "Let her come in alone." The blonde attendant's face instantly sank as she pushed open the door, signaling with her eyes for Klein to enter. The moment of truth is here. Klein took a deep breath and stepped into the room. The door behind him closed with a thud, isolating the inside from the outside. Klein walked across the thick carpet and, using the candlelight from the golden candle racks, saw a rather beautiful lady sitting behind a desk while leaning back. She was wearing beige trousers with her feet extended diagonally while crossed. Her brows were long and straight, and her azure blue eyes were sharp and bright. She wore a white linen shirt, allowing her intimate body to faintly peek through. Raven black curled hair cascaded down to hide the critical bits, making Klein instantly feel uncomfortable. Upon seeing red-haired Helene enter, Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy raised her left hand and asked with an ambiguous smile, "Tell me, how should I punish you?" She held a black leather whip in her hand. "Ma'am, there's always room for discussion." Klein lampooned to resist his discomfort. His eyes first moved upwards before leveling towards her. He said without a hint of emotion, "Returning to this place is already the greatest punishment, anything else is just a bonus. You're as stubborn as usual, yet always so indecisive." Tracy stood up. She was tall and slender, and under the illumination of the candlelight, her figure's shadows danced with extreme charm. She held back her smile and walked towards red-haired Helene, with the leather whip in her left hand. She didn't have an ounce of doubt during this process. Klein noticed that she wore a bangle with inlaid diamonds on her right wrist. The mystical item described by Helene. It can reduce most forms of damage. Klein, who had originally planned to take action the moment the gap between them narrowed, held back his urge. "Oh, they cuffed you. That's nice. We haven't played such a game before," Tracy said with a smile, but her azure blue eyes seemed to be a stormy ocean that was gathering strength. "Ma'am, your lines are quite terrible." Klein pursed his lips tightly and didn't say a word. Tracy came in front of him and raised her right hand to slide down his cheek. "Returning is the greatest punishment." As she spoke, her eyes turned misty, looking extremely alluring. "You usually don't seem to think so. Although you always resist in the beginning, you're often more passionate than me towards the end." Before she finished her sentence, Klein pulled out his left hand from the handcuff, and he grabbed the bangle on her wrist in a manner that was as fast as lightning. He then violently swiped it down. At the same time, that hand turned a shade of gold. Klein's green and deep eyes suddenly lit up with two bolts of lightning. This was creeping hunger. This was psychic piercing. And the ability to pull his hand out of the cuffs was a magician power. It was the bone-softening power which Klein very seldom used. He had long made plans and preparation for what he would do after infiltrating. It was to find a chance to be alone with Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and assassinate her without holding back. Only by doing so did he have a chance of defeating a pirate admiral. Only by doing so could he severely injure and capture her. And even if it couldn't be done, he didn't mind killing her. He was already very accustomed to channeling spirits above the gray fog. He wasn't afraid of not being able to obtain the intelligence he needed. A human trafficker didn't deserve any pity. In addition, in order to prevent himself from tripping himself up, he only brought the most difficult to detect creeping hunger, which was good at disguising itself. The other mystical items were placed in the mysterious space above the gray fog. Furthermore, he was on the Black Death with several opposing Beyonders on board. He had to finish the battle as quickly as possible. This was also to avoid being taken down by Tracy's ailment powers. The longer he fought her, the worse the ailments inflicted on him would be. In that instant, the bangle with inlaid diamonds was removed from Tracy's wrist. Klein's green eyes flashed with lightning while the beautiful and charming Vice Admiral Ailment remained in a daze. All she did was instinctively dodge. She couldn't believe that Helene would attack her, or dare believe that she possessed such reactions and abilities. Tracy saw two bolts of lightning light up in Helene's beautiful emerald-like eyes as the blinding silver occupied her entire vision. Her beautifully contoured chin was suddenly lifted as though she was about to let out a tragic scream. However, she stiffened on the spot, shattering like a mirage. The full-body mirror placed in the room cracked and quickly crumbled, scattering to the floor. Mirror substitution spell. Tracy's figure, in her pure white shirt, beige trousers, and black leather boots, appeared in the corner where the full-body mirror was located. Before she could catch her breath, she heard heavy footsteps and saw red-haired Helene's dress fluttering to the back as she charged forward like a chariot. The glove she wore on her left hand was pale and gloomy green. Klein had already switched to a zombie state. His muscles were taut, and his strength had increased substantially. His sleeves fluttered as he clenched his fist tightly before throwing it at Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy like an iron hammer. Bang! 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 Although he continued maintaining Helene's appearance, his actions were like a ferocious beast's. He was fierce and formidable. As he bombarded Tracy with his punches and kicks, all she could do was desperately parry his attacks without having the time to use other Beyonder powers. If a Demoness of Affliction's corresponding sequence 9 wasn't assassin, allowing her to have extraordinary combat skills and dodging capabilities, this barrage of attacks would have left her heavily injured. Bang! 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 Klein's fist emanated a white, frosty air, causing Tracy to tremble with every time she made contact. Gradually, ice began to form on the surface of her body. This was a zombie's mastery of frost powers. Seeing her blood gradually stiffen, Tracy didn't hesitate and took the blow. Her lips turned pale as her mouth opened slightly as she let out a formless scream. Accompanied by this scream, a blue illusory halo surged out from her body. It left stacked layers of frost in its wake. In just 1 or 2 seconds, both of them found themselves in a frozen world. They were surrounded by thick and transparent ice, and there was loose frost blanketing the exterior. The two looked very close to one another, but they needed to break through the various obstructions to fight each other. To break through the various obstructions to fight each other. A smile appeared on Tracy's gallant and brilliant face as a silent black flame ignited within her body. It quickly melted the surrounding ice as it began to launch a counterattack, allowing Ailment Maiden to grasp the advantage. At this moment in time, she saw Helene, who was often frail and indecisive, snap her fingers without an expression. A matchstick she hadn't noticed lit up as scarlet flames leaped. Instantly, it enveloped the red-haired figure's dress. Tracy's pupils constricted as her spiritual intuition gave her an extreme sense of foreboding. In the silent black flames behind her, Klein leaped out in the form of Helene. He extended both his arms and hugged Tracy, locking her arms in the process. At the same time, he opened his mouth and shouted, "Bang!" A formless air bullet shot out with might that exceeded that of a revolver. It was comparable to the latest rifle models. It passed through the void and accurately hit the back of Tracy's head. Oof! The bullet drilled through her skull, but Vice Admiral Ailment's figure suddenly contracted, turning into a broken black staff. Magic staff substitution spell. Tracy rapidly appeared diagonally across him. The buttons on her shirt dropped as she revealed a mesmerizing view of fair skin. However, what caught Klein's attention wasn't that but the blood on her palm. While Klein restrained Tracy, she had clawed behind her, ripping off a piece of fabric and injuring his thigh. At this moment, Tracy quickly opened and closed her mouth twice as illusory black flames appeared from her palms to burn the blood. This was black magic, a witch's curse. Klein couldn't help but tremble. A black flame ignited from within, from his soles to the top of his head. He was rapidly reduced to paper shreds. Just as he appeared in another corner, he felt countless invisible spider webs swirl towards him. Some were hard and attempted to bind him, while others were soft, in a bid to stimulate different parts of his body. Klein, who was a Beyonder who acted extremely calm during combat, felt his heart race as his ears heated up. His body turned numb and sore, having the discomfort of a cold while having the urge to have his blood surge downwards. Compared to Madame Sharon from Tinjin City, Tracy's spiderweb was far more terrifying. Klein didn't dare to underestimate it as he immediately snapped his fingers. The snap ignited all the surrounding spiderwebs as scarlet flames extended from where they came from and surged towards Tracy like a tidal wave. Back in Tinjin, Klein already knew that the spiderwebs from a demoness of pleasure were weak against fire. Instantly, the middle of the room became a huge ignited web. Tracy was caught by surprise as the flames swept towards her. Humph! She exhaled as an eerie blue illusory light surged outwards and froze her within a transparent but gigantic crystal. The scarlet flames surged over and kept melting the ice, but it gradually weakened. Klein didn't pick up the diamond-inlaid bangle, because he wasn't sure what negative side effects it might have. To rashly use a mystical item without sufficient comprehension of it was highly likely to be harmful rather than beneficial. He straightened his body and opened his arms, letting his left glove be dyed in the lustrous glow of the sun. Priest of Light. At that instant, Tracy, who was hiding inside the ice, felt that extremely familiar Helene wore a holy luster. In between her brows, an unprecedented tenacity surged out. She was pretty and no longer frail. Like a blooming sunflower, she was like a flower of war stained with blood. Tracy shouted with a clearly hoarse voice, "Who are you? Why don't you dare to show yourself? While wearing a dress, using my own looks would look so odd. It's more suitable to use Helene's appearance." Klein detached himself as this thought flashed through his mind. Following that, he praised the sun. A magnificent pure beam of light descended with golden flames swirling around it. It completely blanketed the ice and Tracy. As the ice rapidly melted and vanished at a discernible pace, the bright and holy light dimmed before disintegrating. The color in Tracy's face drained as she did a somersault and agilely dodged Klein's psychic piercing from his switch to the interrogator soul, letting whatever damage she received happen inside the beam of light. The light of holiness was strong against the undead and corrupt, so it was only considered an ordinary sequence 5 strike on a demoness. Bang! 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 Tracy did multiple somersaults and dodged Klein's air bullets, leaving holes in the carpet. As she rolled, her figure vanished from her enemy's sight, a demoness invisibility. Klein bent his back slightly as he was on high guard. He then used his spiritual perception and his sense of danger as a clown to seek out Tracy's location. However, he was unable to find her in that short amount of time. Furthermore, his forehead was heating up and his lungs were burning. His throat hurt and itched. He nearly couldn't keep himself from coughing any longer. No, I can't let this drag out any longer. Klein's thoughts raced as he suddenly laughed deeply. He then used a stiff male's voice and said, "Helene told me your secrets. She also told me all of her secrets." Before he finished his sentence, his spiritual perception was triggered. This was because he discovered an intense emotional fluctuation in a particular corner. The emotions of rage and hatred were impossible to hide from him. Klein immediately turned around and looked over. Instantly, layers of golden scales appeared on his left glove. His eyes were tainted with a pale gold color as his pupils turned vertical. Silently, Tracy's figure was outlined as she wore a painful and twisted expression. Her extremely feminine raven-black curly hair grew uncontrollably as they spread in every direction. Psychiatrist's frenzy. Tracy, whose emotions had been stirred, nearly broke down when faced with such an attack. She temporarily lost her reasoning. Klein took the opportunity and snapped his fingers. An air bullet crossed the distance between them, heading straight for Tracy's face that remained beautiful despite the twisted expression. Suddenly, a wisp of thick, raven-black hair swept over, changing the trajectory of the air bullet. It struck Tracy in the left shoulder, causing her clothes to tear and blood to spurt. Even her bones were exposed. Ah! Tracy let out a shrill cry as immense amounts of black flames spewed out of her body and enveloped her. Following that, thick ice crystals formed outside the black flames. Beyond it, raven-black curly hair that frantically grew wrapped Tracy, the black flames, and the ice in thick layers. It seemed to form a gigantic cocoon made of human hair. Bang! 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 Klein's air bullets shot out one after another, but they only penetrated the black hair and got stuck in the ice. He paused and made his left glove emit the brilliance of the sun. At that moment, his throat itched. Unable to control himself any further, he began coughing violently. He failed to produce the attacks he was preparing to deliver. Inside the black-haired cocoon, Tracy had recovered her senses. She raised her voice and shouted sharply, "Enemy assault! Enemy assault!" At that instant, Klein paused for a second. In his moment of adrift thoughts, he felt as though he had returned to Backland, returning to the first time he encountered the devil dog. He knew he wasn't its match and could only shout, "Murder," and "Save me," before successfully escaping from the danger. At that moment in time, Tracy's cries had the same effect. Even if there weren't a dozen Beyonders on the Black Death, the number was close to that. Furthermore, there were relatively many Beyonders of relatively high sequences. Indeed, killing a pirate admiral in a short period of time is too difficult, even if it's an assassination. Klein coughed twice and snapped his fingers. He stopped attacking and hesitating. He turned and ran for the window in the captain's cabin. The last thing he noticed was the diamond-inlaid bangle, but he didn't dare to retrieve it. Firstly, he was afraid that the severe negative effects would affect his escape, and secondly, he was afraid that Tracy would be able to lead a bunch of Beyonders to pursue him with the help of the item's location after she recovered. A pursuit at sea would then unfold. I can't be greedy. Klein turned his head and smashed through the window and fell onto the deck. Two pirates happened to come over as they thrust their cutlasses forward. Oof! Oof. Their cutlasses pierced through a paper figurine. Klein's figure instantly appeared behind one of the pirates, as he extended his left hand, opening up a ferocious and creepy mouth on his palm. Creeping hunger bit down on its food, while Klein lifted the pirate up before other beyonders rushed over. He took wide steps and ran to the shipboard. Under gunfire, he plunged into the dark sea under the night sky. The ice-cold water instantly inundated Klein, drenching his golden-red dress and making him sink like a rock. At the same time, creeping hunger had already finished eating the pirate, lightening his load. Klein didn't attempt to float up and had instead continued sinking downwards. He could faintly hear splashing sounds across the distant waves. Apparently, pirates from the sailor pathway had engaged in pursuit. This was their home ground. They could act like fish in such environments for a very long period of time. Klein wasn't alarmed. As a magician who never performed unprepared, he had obviously thought of his escape plans if he met with failure. After all, there was nothing guaranteed about such matters. To do his best acting as Helene and not be discovered by Vice Admiral Aylment Tracy, he had not only left the other mystical items and cache above the grey fog, but he had even done so for the charms that came under the water and wind domain that he recently made. However, this didn't affect him. As a god, a blessed, and a believer trinity, he had many miraculous methods to deal with the corresponding situation. He quickly made creeping hunger turn pale and be dyed in a gloomy green. The surrounding seawater froze, forming layers of frost. Before the frost completely turned into ice, Klein spread his wing muscles and spread out his arms. With the strength of a zombie, he shattered the frost, sending them slightly further away. This way, he temporarily produced a narrow space that didn't have any seawater around him. The water instantly surged backwards to fill the space. Klein extended his left palm and released the terrifying cold and spread it out, creating layers of ice walls. For a brief moment, he seemed to be encased in an ice prison. He could stand in it and produce sound, but he was only limited to that tiny space. Klein immediately took tiny steps in a counterclockwise fashion while murmuring, "Blessings stem from the celestial worthy of heaven and earth," before rapidly letting his spirit body go above the grey fog. Just as his body appeared at the fool's high-back chair, he immediately picked up the sea god scepter which he had placed on the table. Without needing to identify anything, he selected the point of light representing Gehrman Sparrow, who had recently been promoted to a believer of sea god. Through a previously established connection, he raised the short milky white scepter and made the blue gems on it emit a blurry luster. He replied to his believer, and augmented himself with all sorts of spells, including but not limited to underwater breathing, freedom of movement, and pressure resistance. Finally, he used a paper angel to interfere with any divination. He then ordered the nearby undersea creatures to help protect Gehrman Sparrow's escape. After doing all of this, Klein didn't delay and had immediately returned to the real world and gained control of his body. At that moment, the seawater's pressure had crushed the constantly melting ice wall and had retaken that independent space. However, Klein could already breathe easily and swim rapidly. Through the rippling but crystalline water, he saw fishes swimming towards him. A dark shadow rose up from beneath his feet as an unknown behemoth rapidly rose. It was a strange brownish-red creature that looked like a squid. It was so massive that its tentacles were enough to bind an entire ship. It spewed black ink and instantly dyed the surrounding sea black. The few sailor pathway beyonders who were pursuing Klein instantly saw black as their bodies turned numb. Unclear of what was happening, they immediately floated to the surface and dealt with the abnormalities in their bodies. By the time they dived down again to find the enemy, they had already lost track of Klein. At this moment, Klein was swimming at the bottom of the sea with great satisfaction. He even had the time to divert his attention to recall his failed operation and reflect on what he had done. I had sufficient preparations to act as Helene. Even Tracy, who had shared numerous nights with her on the same bed, couldn't instantly see through me. It accelerated the digestion of the potion. During this process, I still had to overcome my aversion and find a way to both get into character and be detached. This was extremely helpful to the digestion of the potion. I basically did the best I could for the battle. It can be considered a prepared performance, but I underestimated the strength of a sequence 5 Demoness of Affliction and the experience of someone who inched her way to becoming Vice Admiral Ailment even though she lost her mystical item in the beginning. Just my present strength and my mystical item weren't enough to kill her quickly, unless I had used the Sea God Scepter. But this is around the Rorstad Archipelago. Through today's battle, I can clearly tell that I lack a mystical item with powerful offensive abilities. Facing the reality of a failed mission, Klein was no doubt somewhat disappointed. However, he wasn't depressed, because this wasn't the end of this matter. He planned on writing to Mr. Azek to see if he was interested in the ancient chronicles related to death and if he had the time to pay a visit before Klein left the captain's cabin. He had snapped his fingers to ignite the male clothing he had left in the changing room, as well as any hair or skin he had left behind. This was to make it seem like he didn't wish to leave any traces, but it was in fact a form of concealment and deceit. What he was concealing was the hair and button he had secretly thrown into a particular room without anyone noticing after he entered the cabin. Having wiped away any traces of himself, Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy would mistakenly believe that the assassin was afraid of exposing himself because of the fear of suffering a remote curse. Then, it would be difficult for her to seriously get the pirates to check for any remnant items. With the hair and button, Klein could use divination to lock onto the location of the Black Death up to a certain amount of time. This way, as long as Mr. Azek was willing, he could bring him to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Sigh, I originally thought I wouldn't need Mr. Azek's help. I thought I could succeed just by myself, alone. Ultimately, I fell just short. Klein sighed and felt a blow to his self-esteem. This was one of the reasons why he didn't seek Mr. Azek's help in the beginning. The other reason was that he wasn't certain that Tracy was in possession of the ancient chronicles related to death. If she really didn't have it, it would be rather awkward to have Mr. Azek make a trip for nothing. Furthermore, he was worried that even with Mr. Azek's help, that he would still need to act as Helene to find the Black Death and Tracy. He still needed to wear her clothes and use himself as bait. That would be too embarrassing to do it in front of someone he knew. In fact, if it wasn't to obtain intelligence and solely to eliminate Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, it would have been a lot simpler. Once I swim back to Byam and go above the grey fog, I simply need to lock onto their location and use the Sea God Scepter to create a storm. This isn't to say that a huge area-off attack blast will definitely kill Tracy on the spot, but it will attract Sea King John Cotman's attention. When the time comes, the Black Death's location would be exposed to the Church of Storms. Sea King will happily take down Ailment Maiden. Klein shook his head with self-deprecating mockery. With his seer's spiritual intuition guiding him, he rapidly swam towards the shore. On the Black Death, Tracy removed her layers of defense and walked to the diamond-inlaid bangle, in her damaged, blood-stained clothes. She bent down to pick it up. What a cautious attacker. I might not even be comparable to her back when I was an assassin. No, him. Tracy suddenly clenched her teeth. This wasn't because she nearly died at his hands, but because he had sensed that the man had done something to Helene. According to the way Emperor Roselle put it, she suspected that there was something green, growing on her head. Helene, are you really that cold and heartless? No, perhaps she was forced. Tracy turned her head to look at the nasty wound on her left shoulder as she felt the heart-wrenching pain. If not for the strengthening of her physique brought about by the assassin and instigator sequence, with a significant enhancement in subsequent sequences, just that one blow alone could have made her lose her entire arm. She would be like those pirates who had their arms blown off by rifles. As the blood flowed and stained her vision red, Tracy got the blonde female attendant to enter and use her abilities to help her deal with her injuries while instructing the surrounding pirates who had their eyes fixated on her to search for any items the attacker had left behind. Unfortunately, the pirates informed her that all of his clothes had been automatically destroyed. This made Tracy recall the snap the enemy had made before he left. She sighed once again. How careful. Furthermore, he's not one bit greedy. If he had taken the bangle, then I wouldn't need to worry about not catching up to him. Tracy waved her hand, motioning for most of the pirates to leave, leaving behind Wormtongue Mither King and a few high-ranking members of the crew. Third mate, go to Byam again. Perform a thorough investigation to figure out where the resistance found that Helene, Tracy ordered in a solemn voice. With great difficulty, Mither retracted his gaze from his captain's chest. All right. Tracy thought for a moment and added, spread this matter. Say that I'm seriously injured and will not be able to recover any time soon. Also, first mate, immediately set sail. Don't stay here any longer. As she issued orders, silence was quickly restored around Tracy. Only at this point did she have the time to figure out which faction the attacker came from, why he would attack her, and what motives he had. Unfortunately, the more Tracy thought, the more puzzled she became. She had no idea what the truth was. Although she had many enemies, none of them possessed similar powers. Finally, she found a clue as she muttered to herself, creeping hunger. In the middle of the night, in a private harbor on Blue Mountain Island. Standing by the receding and advancing waves was a female figure. She was none other than Klein, who was still disguised as Helene. He circled under the water and quickly came onto shore. He infiltrated the house of a nearby fisherman and got some tattered clothes to change into before changing back into Gairman Sparrow. Leaving behind the rather expensive dress as compensation, Klein rapidly left the private harbor and returned to the city of Generosity, Byam, before daybreak. He wasn't in a rush to meet up with Danitz. Instead, he found a random motel to stay in. He used a ritual and brought back Azek's copper whistle, other mystical items, and cash back to the real world. After confirming that he could divine the location of the Black Death, he blew the copper whistle. 1. A Chinese saying of being cuckolded, wearing a green hat. After lowering the copper whistle, Klein had already activated his spirit vision. He saw illusory white bones being weakly thrown up from the ground as they slowly formed a gigantic figure. If the past scenes were like a fountain in a fantasy setting, then this was more like the flow from an ordinary reverse tap. The corners of Klein's mouth moved indiscernibly as he pretended as though he hadn't noticed anything amiss. After a few seconds, the skeleton messenger finally took form. Its nearly 4 meters body tore through the ceiling once again as the pitch-black flames in its eye sockets burned silently. Klein folded the letter he had finished writing and threw it up. He described in detail the tycoon, Jimmy Necker, in the letter. He mentioned the connections between the death chronicles found in the southern continent's Balam Empire's mausoleum, as well as the connection the item had with Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos and Vice Admiral Aylman Tracy. He also mentioned how he had successfully sneaked in, and although his assassination had failed, he had left behind something that could be used to determine the location of the Black Death. Of course, he didn't go into detail how he sneaked in. He had only roughly recounted Vice Admiral Aylman Tracy's combat techniques and style. After the messenger caught the letter with a swipe that could send an adult human flying, Klein coughed and cleared his throat. I already have a messenger. The pitch-black flames in the skeleton messenger's sockets clearly flickered before its body collapsed like a waterfall before drilling into the parquet. You don't have to be afraid of becoming my messenger anymore, right? Am I that detestable to your kind? Yes. These messengers from the underworld probably can't bear to leave Mr. Azek. After all, that's a direct descendant of death. There might not even be any skip in the generational line. You want to cozy up with someone powerful. I get it. Klein was just about to pack up and check out when his nose itched suddenly and sneezed. Achoo. Achoo. Cough. 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 Mucus flowed out as he coughed. His forehead slowly but decisively began burning with heat. Oh no. Vice Admiral Aylman's ailment is still lingering in my body. And I confronted a 10 degrees Celsius cold wind in order to return to Byam. I really fell ill as a result. Klein used inferior tissue paper to wipe his mucus, contemplating whether to summon himself and act using a spirit-body state, so that his physical body could heal by itself. After serious consideration, he believed that it was impossible. Firstly, his physical condition would clearly affect his spirit body's condition. The two were closely related in some magical manner. Secondly, if he ignored it, his physical condition would definitely worsen. I'm becoming a little dazed from the fever. Klein touched his forehead and prepared to return to the Wind of Azure Inn to meet up with Danitz. Then, he had to consider if he should head to a hospital or clinic to buy some medicine. In the Berg household in the city of Silver, Derek finally obtained the radiant spirit-packed tree fruit from Mam Hermit, and he successfully concocted the Solar High Priest potion. It was golden in color and had a scorching hot temperature. When Derek drank it, he felt the burning sensation in his throat. His eyes lit up suddenly as they grew brighter, like there were two miniature suns hidden in them. His body radiated concentric ripples of pure light as his exposed skin protruded to form black patterns that were visible to the naked eye. At the same time, his body hair grew longer, as though they were changing into feathers that were swirling with golden flames. Derek knew that there would be similar changes when consuming a potion at sequence 7. He didn't panic or become flustered. He clenched his teeth and repeatedly recalled that pain of him personally killing his parents and the hope that arose from the depths of his heart after meeting Mr. Fool. Despite being on the brink of losing control, he managed to persevere through it. After a while, everything abnormal about him was restored back to normal. However, the air he exhaled was mixed with the warmth of the sun. He felt that his body had become stronger again, and he had some considerable resistance against ailments and treacherous environments. However, that wasn't the main point. Derek liked the various theurgical knowledge that appeared in his mind. They included Fire of Light, Horror Immunity, Holy Oath, Cleave of Purification, Sun Halo, Holy Light Summoning, Holy Water Creation, etc. Derek paced around in delight as he felt that the related theurgical spells he had were very suitable for him in dealing with the evil monsters that hid in the dark. He didn't hide the news and immediately ran to the Twin Towers and recorded the information of his advancement. This way, after a preliminary inspection, he would have the qualifications to helm a small patrolling team as its captain. He could come into contact with more of the City of Silver's information. This includes the method to removing the mental corruption of a Beyonder characteristic, which Mr. World wants. While Derek was answering the registration clerk's various questions, he couldn't help but recall the promise that he hadn't been able to fulfill all this time. Owing something to others often left him uneasy and uncomfortable. And now, he could finally see the light that could restore his calm. In the Amiris Leaf Bar, Wormtongue Mither King was holding a cup of red wine. He sat across from the elderly strongman Ozil, crossed his right leg, and leisurely asked, "Did you figure out anything specific?" He had been instructed by his captain, Vice Admiral Aylmont Tracy, to return to Byam and investigate the fake Helene. For this, he found Ozil, who had originally issued the mission. He couldn't directly seek out the resistance, because there was a small chance that they were cooperating with the fake Helene. To question them in person was no different from directly bringing his head to the Governor General's office in exchange for the bounty reward. Ozil pulled a chair and sat down. "They didn't hide anything, but I can't be sure if they're speaking the truth or not. As you know, I prefer using fists rather than brains. They said that Helene was brought over by Blazing Danitz. He represented Vice Admiral Iceberg and hoped to establish a cooperative relationship with the resistance. They wanted to provide a certain amount of help, and Helene was a way to express their goodwill." Blazing Danitz. Vice Admiral Iceberg. Mither ruminated over the two names as his expression slowly turned solemn. He leaned back into his chair as he knitted his brows bit by bit. As one of Vice Admiral Hurricane's former captains, he was now the third mate of Vice Admiral Aylmont's flagship. He was no stranger to the other pirate admirals, and he knew that Vice Admiral Iceberg was powerful and had a rich collection. With just one ship and a few subordinates, she was able to resist the other pirate admirals. In terms of strength, she was a little stronger than two of his bosses. More pertinently, Vice Admiral Iceberg seldom involved herself in the conflict between pirates. She sought information and explored the unknown to seek out treasure. She was more like an adventurer than a pirate. Why would she suddenly want to assassinate Captain? This doesn't suit her character. She previously suffered a setback because of Admiral of Blood's rumors. She should be focusing on seeking revenge on him. Mither took a sip of red wine as he rubbed his forehead with his other hand. He temporarily stopped thinking about Vice Admiral Iceberg, and he placed his attention on Blazing Danitz. As he carefully recalled, his pupils suddenly shrank. He discovered that there were some recent problems regarding this fourth bosun of the Golden Dream he was familiar with. He laid a trap and killed Steel Mavady, Blood Brambles Hendry, and Calm Squall. His bounty was raised to 4,200 pounds, and in a short period of time, he got embroiled in some matter, causing his bounty to rise again, reaching 5,500 pounds. This has already exceeded my bounty. Mither thought to himself silently as Blazing Danitz's figure surfaced before him. He found him mysterious and terrifying. He advanced. Or did he receive some great benefits because of something? Mither leaned forward and put down the cup. He whispered seriously, I originally treated his bounty increase as a joke. But reality has informed me that Blazing Danitz is a great pirate worthy of a 5,500 pound bounty. Mither looked up and said to Strongman Ozil, help me seek out intel on Blazing. The recent ones. In the luxurious suite in the Wind of Azure Inn. When Danitz opened the door and saw Gehrman Sparrow, he glanced around warily before making way. How was it? Did the hunt succeed? He asked in excitement and curiosity after closing the door. Vice Admiral Ailment is a famous beauty. Back when I saw her, she was even more charming than I imagined. What a pity if she were to just die like that. She should be locked up forever without parole. Pooey. How can she be prettier than Captain? Those with looks like her are plenty in the Red Theater. Contradictory thoughts ran through Danitz's head. Klein clenched his fist and placed it to his mouth before coughing violently. After calming down, he answered coldly, almost. What a pity. Danitz sighed. But deep down, he was thinking, this madman, Gehrman Sparrow, is really strong. He infiltrated the Black Death to assassinate Vice Admiral Ailment but was only just fell short of success. Even though he failed, he successfully returned almost without any injuries. One had to know that the reason why every pirate admiral was famous throughout the 5 seas, being second only to the 4 kings, wasn't only because they themselves were strong, it was also because they represented a crew, a force to be reckoned with. They had many Beyonders under them. To be able to escape from the Black Death after a failed assassination had indicated that Gehrman Sparrow was in no way weaker than any pirate admiral. Is creeping hunger really that powerful? No, even if I were in his shoes and had creeping hunger, I wouldn't be able to go that far. Danitz was increasingly convinced that his choice of not resisting during his first encounter with Gehrman Sparrow was extremely wise. Klein coughed twice again and prepared to instruct Danitz to buy some medicine for him from the hospital. He then recalled that the cause of his illness was complicated. The medicine provided to him without a doctor's careful examination might not be effective. Even the many medicines that Emperor Roselle had previously invented were the same. If it wasn't because it's impossible to use the grey fog to establish a remote treating system, I really wish that I could consult Emlyn White to make me some medicine. Klein went to the washroom to wash up and change into his original clothes and burn the clothes he obtained from the fisherman. Upon seeing him come out, Danitz went over with a paper bag and said in a sycophantic manner, "This is the 700 pounds they gave." At this point, he and Klein heard someone knock on the door. It was Captain Eland. When the captain rushed into the room, he gave Gehrman Sparrow a deep look and suppressed his voice. I planned on returning to Pritz Harbor, but I received a piece of intel. Something huge seemed to have happened at Bansi Harbor. The Church of Storms has finally taken action on Bansi Harbor. Klein clenched his fist and placed it to his mouth before coughing. He asked calmly without any qualms, what happened? Elan didn't notice any abnormal reaction from Gehrman Sparrow. He retracted his gaze and surveyed the area. I don't know what exactly happened. I only know that it might have involved the upper echelons of the Church of Storms. And for a period of time before that, all routes that lead to Bansi Harbor were cancelled. This might have been a so-called omen. Involved the upper echelons of the Church of Storms? No, it should be the most elite forces. I suspect that the pontiff of the Church of Storms, that grounded angel, had personally taken action. He might have even used a Grade 0 sealed artifact. After all, he might be facing a king of angels, one that's even older than the fourth epoch, as well as his descendants. Klein nodded and calmly asked, what's the outcome? He wasn't the least bit surprised that the Church of Storms had only taken action on Bansi Harbor in the past few days. Even though the mandated punishers were known for being rash and irascible, there was still a protocol that needed to be followed for serious matters like this. For example, they needed to make a confirmation, evacuate a portion of innocent residents, or seal off the surrounding sea. All of this needed time. Eland was unable to read Gehrman Sparrow's true emotions as he sighed with a smile. There won't be a Bansi Harbor for a very long period of time. As expected of the Church of Storms. Klein secretly clicked his tongue, feeling even more curious about the detailed process. He wanted to know whether Red Angel Medici had appeared, and if he really was sleeping near Bansi Harbor. He wanted to know if he had been wiped out by the Church of Storms and wished to know what happened to the natives in Bansi Harbor. He wanted to know what it meant for them to speak in such a staccato manner, and he wished to know what secrets were hidden in the Green Lemon restaurant and the telegraph office. Unfortunately, with Bansi Harbor's destruction, it was difficult for him to obtain any actual answers. Perhaps the internal record of the Church of Storms would mention them, but Klein had no way of getting them. With the hanged man's rank, there was no way he could gain access to such confidential information. I'll have to nurture Mr. Hanged Man into a high-sequence demigod before I can know the answers to my questions. Klein sighed silently and said without a change in expression, that place is indeed very dangerous. Before he finished his sentence, his throat itched as he coughed violently. You fell ill? Eland asked, puzzled. He originally imagined that Gehrman Sparrow was like him, a Beyonder whose physique had been considerably enhanced. It was unlikely for Beyonders like them to fall ill before they grew weak from age. But from the looks of it, his previous guess might have been wrong. Klein answered tersely without giving an explanation. A question of no value or meaning. It would be odd if he isn't ill after an intense battle with Ailment Maiden. Danitz grumbled in contempt from the side. Elan chuckled and said, I can recommend you an apothecary that's better than a hospital or clinic. That's his Beyonder job. He has a tiny herb store in the alley diagonally across Red Theater. He's known for selling male enhancements, but that's not what he's best at. Does every apothecary develop such medicine? That's right. It's absolutely one of the most profitable medicine-based businesses. It's only odd not to do it if they're capable of doing it. Klein nodded slightly in response. Why haven't I heard of him? Danitz asked, surprised. He only came to Byam in the past few months. When was your last visit here in the City of Generosity? Eland asked with a chuckle. When I took your crappy boat. Danitz answered silently in his mind. He carefully recalled and discovered that in the past few months, apart from this period of time, he had passed by Byam once during the early days of his vacation. At other times, he was drifting out at sea in search of treasure. Otherwise, he was at other places or harbors enjoying himself, so it was true that he wasn't aware of any minor changes in the City of Generosity. I've already spent quite a few days in Byam. I've been to the Red Theater several times, but I've not heard anything about this apothecary. This can only serve to imply that his male enhancement medicines are limited in effect. Danitz bragged as he said stubbornly. Elan smiled and didn't debate with the great pirate. Instead, he said to Gehrman Sparrow, if it's only an ordinary ailment, the apothecary will only charge a slight premium. And for you, it doesn't matter if it's expensive. What's most important is to recover your health as quickly as possible. No adventurer wishes to stay in a sick state. This implies danger and that you might become the target of someone else. It implies the increased risk of losing control. Indeed, maintaining a good state is a rather important matter for Beyonders. However, the price is still very important, alright? If that apothecary were to charge £1,000, then I might as well buy medicine from the hospital. Or I can describe the situation of my illness and get that vampire, Emlyn White, to make me some medicine. Although I already have £6,000 in savings and have several Beyonder characteristics, I still need to consider it. I still want to add a mystical item with lethal offensive power and seek out clues to the high-sequence potion formula. Klein mumbled inwardly. High-sequence potion formulas were impossible to put a price on in this mysterious world. Therefore, Klein only thought of buying the relevant clues. After Eland left, Klein took the £700 and gave Danitz £200. Wearing his hat and holding his cane, he coughed and wiped his snot before stepping out the door in preparation to take a carriage to the vicinity of the Red Theatre. Danitz was very curious about the apothecary's medicine. He pasted 2 mustaches on his face, wore a cap, and followed. With Klein's guidance, he already knew that using a scarf to hide his face was an act that strongly attracted attention in Byam. He took his advice to buy some fake mustaches. In the alley diagonally across the Red Theatre, the moment Klein entered, he saw a man furtively come out of a nameless herb store. The moment the man saw someone, he hurriedly lowered his head and rushed off. Don't worry. We won't be guessing what medicine you're buying. Klein coughed twice again, increased his pace, and walked into the dark herb store. He scanned the area and was surprised because the boss was someone he knew. The boss was wearing a black robe that resembled a village witch doctor. He was in his 30s, with black hair and brown eyes. His face was round and his body chubby. He was none other than the chubby apothecary who often liked to use sarcasm at the gathering held by old Mr. Eye of Wisdom in Backland. Klein had once recognized him at a circus. He stopped showing up at old Mr. Eye of Wisdom's Beyonder gathering because he left Backland. Klein coughed and took 2 steps forward. Make some medicine for me. On the chubby apothecary's shoulder stood a round-eyed owl. The man and the bird looked up at the same time at Klein. After a brief examination, the chubby apothecary revealed a warm smile. Friend, it's cold outside. Don't do those deeds out in the open, although it's true that it can be rather exciting. What the hell? Klein was first stumped before he understood what he was getting at. When batting Tracy, I was influenced by her pleasure powers. Blood flowed down to my nether regions, and my desires undulated. This resulted in my body emptying out, making it faster and easier for the ailment to strike me. When escaping, the ice-cold sea was fine since I had theurgical spells protecting me. But the wind on the way back was rather cold. It worsened my sickness. In conclusion, doesn't this look like getting sick as a result of having pleasure out in the open? As expected of a apothecary, he has sharp eyes. Klein maintained a composed expression and just looked at him without answering him. All he did was wait for him to concoct the medicine. Danitz turned his head to look out the herb store as he held back his laughter with great difficulty. What dog**t apothecary is this? He can't even distinguish the ailments released by Ailment Maiden. He thought in glee. When the chubby apothecary didn't get a response, he dully opened some cabinets, took out some common or strange herbs and insect carapaces, stuffed them into a paper bag, and handed it over. Put it all in water and cook it for half an hour. Drink the liquid that's left over, for Soli. It's a little expensive. Klein glanced at Danitz. The latter immediately took out the money automatically. As the chubby apothecary collected the money, he bent his back and suppressed his voice to say with a chuckle, "I have medicine that can make you stand out in that area. The kind that has mummy powder added. Need it? I guarantee you that you'll be satisfied. I know you might be very strong, but men always seek to be stronger. Firstly, I need to have a girlfriend." Klein coldly shook his head and rejected the chubby apothecary's recommendation. The chubby apothecary straightened his back in disappointment. He turned his gaze and sized up the two before asking, "Are the both of you adventurers?" "Yes," Klein answered simply. The chubby apothecary rubbed his hands and said, "I have a request, but you'll only be paid after completing it. How big is the reward?" Klein pinched his nose. 100 pounds. The chubby apothecary shouted as his heart pained for the money. "Help me find someone. His name is Roy King. He's my teacher. He got me to meet him here, but I haven't seen him after waiting for months. And I have no way of contacting him. Is there a portrait, or a photograph?" Klein inquired. The chubby apothecary took out a photograph from a secret pouch by his waist and handed it over. It was of a relatively young man. His hair was neatly combed back and he wore glasses. He appeared very gentlemanly. "Your teacher?" Klein asked. "I might believe it if you're the teacher." The chubby apothecary coughed dryly and said, "He's at least 60, but he looks young." "A beyonder power or a mystical item?" Klein nodded in thought and began asking about the specifics. After confirming that there weren't any items he could use to divine, he took the paper bag and left the store. After he disappeared from the alley, the owl standing on the chubby apothecary's shoulder suddenly said, "Darkwill, that guy might know you." "What? He knows me?" The chubby apothecary, Darkwill, was alarmed as he whispered back. The owl's round eyes looked ahead and said, "I noticed that he clearly paused for 2 seconds the moment he saw you when he came in. Perhaps he thinks someone like me doesn't match his image of an apothecary." The chubby apothecary retorted. The owl spread its wings and landed. "Suit yourself if you wish to think so. What books have you been reading recently?" The fat on the chubby apothecary's face trembled. The owl replied sternly and seriously, "My reading is based on your knowledge standards such as those involving soccer. Unfortunately, the words you grasp and can teach me are limited. I have no choice but to read popular novels that have a lower requirement on one's vocabulary. Besides, they're all serialized on the newspaper." Darkwill chuckled. "I'll buy a recipe cookbook later. It's called Guide to East Balam Bird Culinary Methods." Without waiting for the owl to answer, his expression sank and he muttered to himself, "He knows me. He looks like the standard Loanese man. More than half his blood is at least Loan. I used a fake name to stay in a few cities in Loan. It's not odd to be recognized by him. But I still need to be on guard. If I don't receive any news about Old Man before March, then I have to leave this place." Having said that, he turned his head to look at the owl who was perched on his shoulder. "At times, you're still rather useful. No, your eyes and your body language tells me that your real thoughts are, darn it, I wanted to buy a pet that can help me beat monsters and gangsters. I sought out beyonder ingredients of a potion recipe according to the standards of a dragon, but I ended up getting a silly bird who only knows how to read newspapers and plays. Darn it, I want to stuff another potion down its throat." The owl repeated like a parrot by mimicking the chubby apothecary's tone. Darkwill's expression stiffened for a few seconds before he chuckled. "It's good that you know this, silly bird. If I didn't have the powers of a beast tamer, you wouldn't have even managed a single potion." Inside the herb store, the man and bird fell into silence. After a while, the owl pretended as though nothing had happened as it asked, "Darkwill, is it really going to work? You've already entrusted this to dozens of adventurers. I'm not good at finding people, so I can only entrust it to someone else. Besides, they have to find and confirm Old Man's location before I make a payment. I don't even need to spend a single penny. The chubby apothecary sked as he said before he sighed. Old man always calls himself a lucky person and a winner of fate. He should be fine. Will the medicine brewed from this really be effective? While returning to the Wind of Azure in via carriage, Danitz looked at the paper bag beside Klein. The things inside were black herbs, strangely shaped insect carapaces, and weirdly colored flowers. It didn't seem like anything reliable. Klein nodded. Yes. You haven't drunk it. Danitz subconsciously retorted. I trust him. Although his mouth stinks and is rather vile, he has a rather kind heart. Besides, Captain Eland believes that his medicine is sufficiently effective. As Gehrman Sparrow, Klein didn't respond to Danitz's doubts. He directly picked up the paper bag and threw it over. Without needing any spoken words, Danitz knew what he meant. He was in charge of brewing the medicine. Furthermore, he was accustomed to doing similar matters recently, so he didn't have any urges to resist. After returning to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein got a chair to sit in while he watched Danitz light up the fireplace and prop up a pot. He then added water and the herbs into it. Leaning back, Klein felt his head feel groggy. He was very exhausted and felt like he could fall asleep at any moment. In order to wait for the medicine to finish brewing and for him to quickly resolve his illness, he forced himself to consider various problems to combat the fatigue. On careful consideration, during the battle with Vice Admiral Ailment, if I hadn't succeeded in sneaking in an attack on her and suppressing her from the very beginning, preventing her from getting into her rhythm until she eventually found a chance to force open a gap between us by turning invisible, then I might have not been her match. The two powers of invisibility in ailments are really like a bug in a game. Matched with an assassin's lethal strike, and the interference of pleasure, it really makes one unable to find and hit her or escape. One can only watch their body gradually weaken and become inflicted with all sorts of ailments. One can even get mesmerized and give up resisting. On the one hand, it's because every sequence 5 is very powerful. As expected of the sequence just before a demigod. On the other hand, it's because Creeping Hunger's various powers aren't a good match. It cannot be considered to be multifaceted without any weaknesses. Yes. The powers of a Sequence 5 Nimblewright Master of the Seer Pathway is highly effective against invisibility. I can try to help the chubby apothecary find his teacher in the meantime, but without any information, with just a picture, I can only try my luck. I'll have to see when I can directly find a clue. After all, I'm not a god, and I can't find people remotely. Wait, in a certain way, I am a god. I can get god believers to help find him. As long as that old gentleman named Roy King once visited Byam, he would have definitely encountered others and be seen by them. Most native residents secretly believe in god. This is what it means by a sea of people. Also, before Captain Eland leaves Byam, I should get him to introduce me to a point of contact for the military. In the future, I can get him to reimburse me for any intel. They can also check if there were any travelers named Roy King, who registered on any liners in recent months. There's another method. I've placed the radio transceiver above the gray fog for some time. I should be able to contact the magic mirror, Barodes, if I take it down. I was originally planning on asking for Helene's location, but I no longer need to find the red-haired lady anymore. I can switch to Roy King. For a matter which many adventurers have no clue on how to begin, I have 3 solutions. Amidst his thoughts, Klein finally held on until the medicine was successfully brewed. Looking at the bottle of blackish-green liquid that Danitz brought over, he hesitated for 2 seconds before extending his hand to receive it and placed it to his mouth. Gulp. Klein immediately felt his throat burn as his face flushed red. This made him recall his attempt at eating crazy spicy food in his previous life. Suddenly, his entire person awakened as his stuffy nose quickly cleared. Gulp. Gulp. He barely finished drinking it and felt as though he had nearly recovered from his sickness. By nighttime, he had fully recovered. He no longer showed any doubt towards an apothecary's abilities. No wonder the potion's name is Apothecary. Klein wore his hat and left the inn with Danitz. Under the cloak of night, they left Byam and came to a secret harbor hidden on the other end of the jungle. Tonight, the Golden Dream was providing aid to the resistance. After some coordination and hassle, Danitz used the Soulfall ritual to contact Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. After some time, the ship, that was often scrubbed clean and had a strange main cannon, docked by the private harbor. Its gigantic sails drew 5 types of gold coins. They were the gold pound of Lone, the gold horn of Faysac, the Vril gold of Intis, the gold rizet of Fainapotter, and the Sasson gold of Lenberg. This was the flag of the Golden Dream. It was also the symbol of this pirate crew. It's still not professional enough. If it were me, I would add Porter gold from Mason, Z plus Odie from Seeger, Motif gold coins from Balam Empire, etc. Klein stood by the side with his hands in his pocket as he watched Edwina Edwards appear at the bow. At that moment, she was wearing a hunter's hat, a rider's shirt, and a black coat. She matched the image of a female pirate admiral in the minds of the resistance. She often dresses like she's a private tutor. Klein mumbled and took a few steps back, allowing Danitz to run around and busy himself. This pirate worth 5,500 pounds did the liaison, sending a batch of food and fabric to Kalat and the resistance before the transaction came to a close. Danitz secretly inhaled and came to Klein's side and forced a smile. There's nothing else, right? I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Also, how do you plan on settling the hiring fee? That's only an excuse your captain and I used. In a particular sense, this batch of food and fabric is my payment. Klein nodded. Your captain has already paid. You can return. For real. Danitz found it unbelievable. Although Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina wasn't far behind him, he was still afraid that Gehrman Sparrow would suddenly have a crazy fit. Klein didn't reply and turned around, walking straight towards the path that led out of the private harbor. Danitz exhaled silently and held back his excited feelings before briskly running back to the Golden Dream. Only when the Golden Dream steered far away into the night, with the private harbor that belonged to the resistance slowly shrinking in size, did he really believe that he was back on the Golden Dream. At that instant, he felt that he had experienced just too many things over the past half a month or so. It was an unprecedented level of exhilaration, as though it was an interesting dream. At this moment, a sailor came close and asked out of curiosity, "Boss, was Steel Mavady really killed by you?" Danitz immediately laughed out loud and secretly stole a glance at Captain Edwina before saying to his subordinate, "I contributed greatly to this deed. Let's talk over drinks." Above the dark sea, the Golden Dream drifted off into the distance. After returning to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein was just about to sleep when he saw the surrounding colors turn abnormally bright. The white bedsheets turned whiter, and the brown floorboards turned more brownish yellow. The dark red curtains appeared like fresh blood. In the scene with all sorts of colors stacked upon each other, Isaac Eggers suddenly walked out from a rippling aqueous void. He was dressed in his usual shirt, bow tie, tailcoat, and a top hat. His skin was bronze in color, and he had soft facial features. How enviable! I also wish to have such powers of traveling through the spirit world. Klein silently sighed as he smiled in greeting while maintaining his appearance. Good evening, Mr. Isaac. Isaac took off his top hat and looked at the rather unfamiliar face. Without finding it strange, he chuckled. Apologies. I came in a hurry. I should have knocked on the door. What's the exact situation with those death chronicles? Klein invited him to have a seat. He then described in detail things he couldn't explain in the letter. Towards the end, he mentioned in passing about the matter regarding Bansi Harbor, saying how it involved King of Angels Medici and his descendants. Isaac leaned back into the chair and said with a frown, "There's such a name in my memories. He should have the 2 titles of Red Angel and War Angel. However, he had perished long ago." Perished long ago? Klein asked in surprise. Isaac nodded and thought over it. I remember that, he was killed by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Killed by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Klein's pupils shrank as he recalled the evil spirit that loitered in the underground ruins beneath Backlund. It had claimed to be an innocent killed by the Blood Emperor. Could it be that that evil spirit is Red Angel Medici, the King of Angels who once served that creator and was one of the founders of Rose Redemption? Klein instantly generated such a thought and began utilizing backward inference to seek out any traces or clues. The former holder of the Red Priest card was attracted to the underground palace because of a certain level of attraction and had died beside the Tudor descendants. The evil spirit I saw in my dream could easily kill a powerful dragon back when it was alive. It knows the potion formula of the Mutant Pathways Sequence 4 and even more. It's very aware of matters regarding Rose Redemption. The Orthodox churches that have existed ever since the Cataclysm don't know that the former Binzi and that the present Bansi has a descendant of the Medici family residing there, but the evil spirit was able to provide the corresponding information. There's a very high chance of deriving this from the death of Red Angel Medici. And this King of Angels was actually killed by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Does this mean that the latter had already exceeded Sequence 1 and had reached the rank of true God as a Sequence 0 and could no longer be witnessed directly? That evil spirit said so itself that in the late stages of the Fourth Epoch, Solomon Empire's Dark Emperor, Tudor Empire's Blood Emperor, and Trunsoist Empire's Night Emperor were fighting for the position of Sequence 0 until Alista Tudor went crazy. Does this mean that from that point onwards, Blood Emperor was a half-crazy true God? Right, Mr. Azek mentioned in the letter that he lost his senses from merely being glanced at by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Back then, he was at least a Sequence 4 demigod. To have such might, it can only be explained that Blood Emperor was at the true God level. Mr. Azek also described the revival of the true Dark Emperor in his letter. He described him as sitting on a gigantic throne as he overlooked the land. For the Dark Emperor to revive and return, there is a high chance that he was a true god at the Sequence 0 rank. If that were the case, the War of the Four Emperors was of a higher order than I previously imagined. It's no longer a battle of three sequences fighting for the position of Sequence 0. Klein connected all the dots from the past, gaining a brand new understanding of Fourth Epoch history. But as a result, many questions arose. If that ancient evil spirit really is King of Angels Medici, then the underground palace might very well belong to Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Then, why would there be two thrones of equal standing? Why would there be 6 humanoid statues of the true gods? Why would the half-crazy Blood Emperor kill Red Angel Medici? After he became Sequence 0, which spot did he occupy? Firstly, Dark Emperor can be eliminated. It can't be Red Priest, right? Red Angel Medici was killed for its Beyonder characteristic. But Red Priest and Dark Emperor do not seem like neighboring pathways that allow exchanging. I can basically confirm that the former is paired with the Demonis pathway. Yes. Captain mentioned before that consuming the potions of other pathways might not mean death, but there's a high probability of going mad and obtaining warped but terrifying powers. This matches Blood Emperor's half-crazy trait. In his final step, as there was no hope for Dark Emperor and any neighboring pathways, he took the craziest choice and switched to another pathway that's completely unrelated, becoming half-crazy as the price. But the same problem arises. Advancing to Red Priest requires King of Angels Medici to be killed, but before advancing, Alista Tudor wouldn't have been able to complete it by himself. Unless he had more sequences helping him or other Sequence 0 true gods. Upon realizing this, the statues in the underground palace suddenly flashed past Klein's mind. The Evernight Goddess statue who used the moon as a pillow, the Earth Mother statue that hugged a baby in her bosom, the Lord of Storm statue that had lightning flashing behind him, the handsome Eternal Blazing Sun statue, the tall and royal God of Combat statue, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom statue who wore a hood all cast ice-cold gazes at him from the darkness. At that instant, Klein couldn't help but tremble. However, he remembered that the 6 gods supported the Trunsoist Empire, not the Tudor Empire. The history of the fourth epoch becomes more harrowing and confusing the more you delve into it. Klein sighed secretly. What are you thinking about? Isaac Eggers noticed his pause. Klein said in passing, one was only thinking that since Red Angel Medici had long perished at the hands of Alista Tudor, then who is the god of weather who has a following in Bansi Harbor during the recent centuries? And what's the reason for their odd behavior? With this in mind, Klein came to a pause. This was because the matter regarding Bansi Harbor was unlike what he imagined. He originally believed that Red Angel Medici was asleep there, but to his surprise, he had long perished. In that case, the secrets underlying the Green Lemon restaurant and the telegraph office became even more indecipherable. He had no way of deducing anything without any further information. The more he thought about it, the more horrified he became. Could that evil spirit have expected such an outcome when he indicated Binzi town? That might have been a required step for him to escape the seal. Should I tell this matter to Mr. Isaac and gain his opinion? Yes, I'll let Miss Magician, who's in Backlund, to monitor the area and see if there's any abnormalities. If there's none, it can wait till I return to Backlund and contact Miss Sharon. After seeking her opinion, I can inform Mr. Isaac. After all, it's a ruin we explored together. I have to respect her opinion. If there are any abnormalities, then the matter can only be expedited due to the seriousness of the issue. Klein quickly made a decision. When Isaac heard his question, he laughed. Don't think about such matters. They've definitely been buried by the Church of Storms. To forcibly seek out the reasons will only bring about extreme danger. Even at the level of an angel, there's still a chance of perishing. In the mysterious world, curiosity is often the leading cause of death. Klein recalled the matters he had experienced and heard of in the past. He switched to saying, Mr. Isaac, I already have a messenger that I can call my own. Much faster than I imagined, Isaac said with a smile. Klein simply explained how he changed the incantation and how he completed the summoning and ended up encountering an oddity in the spirit world. When summoning spirit world creatures, there's indeed a chance of such things happening when it's not done by someone of the corresponding job. It requires repeated trial and error before obtaining the desired result. But repeated attempts make it easy to encounter danger. Even if you add descriptions like friendly, it isn't absolutely safe. The spirit world creature which is summoned might not have any malicious intent towards you and wouldn't wish to harm you, but it doesn't mean that its very existence won't hurt you. Perhaps just the aura it has can reduce you to a pile of blood. After Isaac heard about the creature whose speed surpassed imagination, the being who was easily neglected, and the creature with extremely high survivability, he laughed and warned him. After that, he asked, how did you succeed in the end? Klein said in embarrassment, I changed the final sentence to a unique being that is willing to be my messenger. 1 inch Isaac was taken aback for a second as he curiously looked at Klein. This description is too generic. Typically, it wouldn't succeed. Perhaps I was rather lucky. Klein cautiously described his messenger's appearance and even hid the matter of her request for a gold coin. Isaac thought over it carefully and said, I do not have an impression of this spirit world creature, but since you've already signed a contract and have had it witnessed by the underworld, she likely wouldn't cause you any harm. However, before you fully understand her, try not to get her to do anything apart from sending letters. All right. Klein originally wanted to say that he had nothing he needed her for other than sending letters when he recalled his battle with Mr. A. The room fell into a brief moment of silence before Klein pulled the conversation back on track. Mr. Isaac, when can we head for the Black Death? The longer the delay, the higher the chances of whatever he left on the Black Death to be cleaned up during the daily cleaning jobs. Now. Isaac stood up and put on his hat. Klein was dressed properly, and just as he was trying to find an excuse to head to the washroom to divine if there would be any danger taking action tonight, Isaac grabbed his shoulder and pulled him into the spirit world. Amidst the stacked colors and nearly formless figures, he heard Mr. Isaac say, let's begin. That direct? Don't you need to confirm things? Perhaps a big shot has his own way of determining the level of danger. Klein silently mumbled and held up his cane and began divining the location of the items he left behind. The cane flew automatically as it tumbled ahead. Isaac followed closely behind with Klein in tow as they smoothly passed through the spirit world. Before long, the black hardwood cane paused with thick black and stacked shadows ahead of it. Through this abstract scene, Klein could vaguely identify it as something resembling the Black Death. At this moment, Isaac's body came to a pause as he solemnly said, "The spirits here tell me that there is danger." There is danger. Something that can make even Mr. Isaac find it dangerous. Vice Admiral Ailment got help. A high-ranking member of the Demonist sect. Klein frowned suddenly. He fully believed the judgment of the big shot, since Sequence 7 of the Death Pathway was spirit medium. After advancing to the realm of demigod, being able to notice this was considered very normal. Isaac half closed his eyes for 2 seconds before opening them. But the problem isn't serious. Let's enter. Problem isn't serious. That's probably the case when it's directed at you. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he decided to change his looks. This way, even if he was no match and had to flee pathetically, he didn't have to be afraid of someone coming to knock on his door. In an instant, Klein possessed a distinctive broad chin and cold blackish-green eyes. His hair turned brown and was tied into a bun at the back of his head like an ancient warrior. He had disguised himself as the former owner of Creeping Hunger, Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. Isaac gave him a glance as the surroundings suddenly seemed to plummet as all sorts of bright colors flew by. In a blink of an eye, Klein found himself in Ailment Maiden Tracy's captain's cabin again. This gallant and brilliant female pirate was wearing a different white shirt. On her left shoulder was a clear bandage while her black hair was coiled up instead of cascading down amorously. Faced with this sudden visitor, she didn't show any panic but smiled. At this moment, a gentle female's voice from a difficult-to-identify location sounded. "It's you. It's you." Upon hearing this surprised and curious female voice, Klein jumped in fright, imagining that he had been recognized by someone. He immediately composed himself because he had already changed his appearance to that of the deceased Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. And inside Kalangos was the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sherlock. And inside Gehrman Sparrow was the identity of the great detective, Sherlock Moriarty. And inside Sherlock Moriarty was the identity of Klein Moretti. This wasn't the end. Deep within Klein Moretti was Mr. Fool, Zhou Mingrui. There's no reason that she can directly see my true essence. Besides, how can she know of a trivial character like Klein Moretti? Even Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos wouldn't have left the Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's helper surprised. To be specially invited by a Sequence 5 pirate admiral to protect herself and deal with her enemy, the person must be at least a Sequence 4 demigod. Therefore, that sentence was directed at Mr. Isaac. That high-ranking demoness recognizes Mr. Isaac, who had destroyed their cooperation with the royal family and in Sangwil in Backlund, or does she recognizes him from one of his former lives? Klein quickly cleared his train of thoughts and remained guarded against Tracy and her helper's sudden attacks. He also looked through the corner of his eye to observe Mr. Isaac's reaction. He wasn't too surprised that a mysterious powerhouse would appear. Firstly, this was because Mr. Isaac had already given a warning, and secondly, it was because he believed that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy wasn't a self-conceited person. To almost be assassinated without knowing the assassin's backing faction and motive, there was a high probability that she would leave the sea around the Rorstad archipelago to seek help from the upper echelons of the Demonist sect. The only thing hadn't expected was that her helper would arrive so quickly. It was as though she was nearby or had a mystical item like that of a traveler. Combining the female characteristics of the voice and the gentleness within it, Klein suspected that it was a demoness at the demigod level. Isaac stood on the thick carpet and said after 2 seconds of hesitation, "You know me?" This tone sounds uncertain. Could it be that my big shot had once spent a period of time with a demoness? No, I can't think of it that way. Klein began to imagine things before he seriously felt penitent for having those thoughts. He noticed that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy wore an aghast look. Her certainty and calm had turned into puzzlement. The gentle female voice sounded out from an unknown location again. I obviously know you. You should also know me. Azek turned his ears to the side to listen before he shook his head and gave a rueful smile. I'm sorry. I've repeatedly lost my memories and am in the midst of recovering them. If you can remind me and invoke more of my memories, I'll be very grateful to you. Upon hearing their conversation, Tracy's puzzled and confused look settled. She cautiously swept her gaze at Klein but frowned when she saw Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos's face. The gentle female voice sighed. The last time we met was 3 years ago. Back then, Primordial and Death were working together, instigating the Pale disaster in the northern continent. You might have already forgotten that we once fought the saints and angels of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. I know this piece of history, it was recorded in Emperor Rosel's diary. Mr. Dorr said that it resulted in the primordial demoness being heavily injured, and she had only managed to descend only in recent times. As for Death, he directly perished and created the Berserk Sea that separated the northern and southern continents. The demoness sect and the forces of Death had previously cooperated, so it's no wonder that a demigod-ranked demoness knows Mr. Azek. Man, she's also a monster that has lived for at least 1400 years. Klein thought with a creative mind. Following that, he felt puzzled again. He originally imagined that Mr. Azek had suffered heavy injuries from being glanced at Blood Emperor Alista Tudor during the War of the Four Emperors, which resulted in him constantly losing his memory and forgetting his past. However, what the demigod-ranked demoness indicated was that not only did Azek survive the War of the Four Emperors, but he had even participated in the Pale disaster many years later. He didn't seem to have any problems in between. Azek closed his eyes as though he was trying to squeeze out his memories. After a few seconds, he asked hesitantly, Katarina Pell. You are already a demoness of unaging. I'm very happy that you can still remember me. I could only be considered a weakling compared to you back then. A figure outlined itself beside Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. She wore a simple and pure white gown which had high slits that revealed her flawless legs. Her skin was as white as snow and as tender as a young maiden's. The woman had black hair and blue eyes, and she looked elegant and pretty. She had an indescribable charm. She looked towards Azek Eggers as a faint smile curled at the corner of her lips. More than 1,000 years have passed. It's a cause for celebration for us to meet, alive. Balam Empire's Mr. Death Consul. Mr. Azek was Balam Empire's Death Consul. This is the name of a later potion in the Death Pathway. This demoness of unaging Katarina Pell looks like she's in her 30s. She's elegant and pure, yet she exudes a mature charm. Wait, why am I thinking of this? Her pleasure charms are already that potent. Katarina hurriedly moved his gaze away and nearly had to use cogitation to calm his emotions. Without waiting for Azek to say a word, Katarina Pell said with a melodic voice, I'm curious over why you would still be constantly losing your memories. I remember that it only happens for your pathway during the undying stage. Dying once every 60 years to revive again and forget the past. However, you have long advanced past that and escaped from that curse. What happened to you at the end of the Pale disaster? Heh, the 7 gods had fractured back then and treated each other as enemies. We both believed that Primordial and Death would succeed, but who knew that the proudest son and the most arrogant tyrant would bow their heads? They quickly joined forces again. If I hadn't managed to advance by chance, then I might have already perished at the end of that divine battle. I believe you should have suffered some damage which resulted in your present state. Death's perishing is itself the greatest injury for you. Azek fell silent as he wore an indistinct painful expression one can't remember. At this moment, Klein realized that Katarina Pell looked somewhat familiar, and he suspected her of being the white-robed lady who had led Madame Sharon onto the path of a demoness. Suddenly, Katarina's eyes turned to sweep a glance at Klein. She chuckled at Isaac and said, I believe you haven't forgotten the reason for visiting today. I'm very curious why he would assassinate Tracy. Could it be for justice? The glance the demoness of unaging swept over was filled with hidden amorousness and sweet playfulness. She resembled an underage young maiden, and her facial features and bearing had magically accentuated that feeling. She didn't have the jarring feeling of a mature lady acting young at all. At that moment, Klein viewed her as a maiden who was 16-17. She can already perfectly present every charm a woman can bring. She has the skin, facial features, and bearing to match it. As expected of a demoness of unaging. Klein had already attempted to use cogitation to resist this indescribable charm. He took the initiative to look at ailment maiden Tracy. Do you know the tycoon named Jimmy Necker? Tracy gaped her mouth before closing it again. She replied blankly and aggrieved, who is he? You might not know him. He once collected a batch of ancient chronicles related to death. He died at the hands of Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, Klein said while bearing the appearance of Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. Tracy narrowed her eyes. She wore a dazed look before turning angry. You came for those documents? It really is in your hands. Klein determined based on her tone. He answered indifferently. That's right. Tracy inhaled slightly and said, Where's Helene? Did you do anything to her? I know she's still alive. If something happens to her, my spiritual intuition will tell me. Klein didn't attempt to speak ambiguously as he directly answered her, she has already returned to Intis to lead a brand new life. Tracy's expression sank. A storm raged in her eyes as the aura of a pirate admiral fully revealed itself. However, Isaac casually swept his gaze over and instantly made her calm down. The corners of her lips curled up. That batch of documents from the mausoleum of the Balam Empire's royalty is indeed in my hands. But I wasn't interested in it. I flipped through it casually before handing it to the sect. Even if you had succeeded in assassinating me, you wouldn't have received it. I didn't read it much, so even if you channeled my spirit, I wouldn't be able to reproduce it. Unfortunately, I can't bear to part with my life. Otherwise, it definitely would have been interesting to see your disappointment, Klein calmly said. No, I won't be disappointed. I can obtain the soul and characteristic of a demoness of affliction. I can graze you and subdue you. As he spoke, he raised his left palm which had creeping hunger on it. It was in the shape of a black glove. Tracy narrowed her eyes. The look in her eyes became extremely dangerous, like a provoked tiger. If not for the two high-sequence beyonders beside her, she might have already attacked. And the moment Klein finished his sentence, he noticed something amiss. I'm not acting as Gehrman Sparrow at the moment, so why am I speaking in accordance with his persona? Klein was alarmed as he suspected whether he had been too into character recently. Remember, you can only be yourself. I cannot be influenced by the character I act as, because of prolonged acting. This will cause me to become lost and result in losing control. He quickly reflected on himself and added his conclusions into the acting principles of a faceless. Noticing his brief silence, Isaac looked at Katarina Pell and said in his usual tone, Can you copy a set of those documents for me? That's not a big problem. Katarina gave Tracy a glance. Any requests? Tracy stared at Klein and said with a clearly hoarse voice, Tell me where Helene is. Klein withdrew his thoughts and looked at her before looking at the pure demoness of unaging, Katarina. He had already made his decision, but he couldn't help but feel hesitant. He turned to look at Mr. Isaac and discovered his warm smile. He wasn't urging him or forcing him. Klein retracted his gaze and simply said, I refuse. For an instant, Klein imagined that Tracy would directly attack him, as her face was already flushing red with anger. Her blue eyes had turned dark like the surface of a sea before an impending storm. But eventually, Tracy didn't act rashly. She looked towards Katarina Pell and awaited the decision of the demoness of unaging. She knew very well that, although Sequence 5 and Sequence 4 were just separated by one level, there was a qualitative difference between them. There was no way to bridge the gap with one's battle skills or execution. One was a normal human with special powers, while the other was already a demigod, a legendary creature possessing godhood. Furthermore, the two present were clearly not Sequence 4. Placed before them, Tracy felt like she was a low sequence beyonder. Katarina Pell didn't seem furious. She looked at Klein, who wore the face of Kalangos, and chuckled as her eyes moved across him. What an interesting lad. If not for Mr. Death Consul being here, I might have not revealed the upheavals within my heart and have an unexpected encounter with you which would lead into having a pure and romantic story with you. No, you don't want to. This sounds really terrifying. Klein didn't dare look at her as he continued looking at Tracy. Seeing no response from Isaac Eggers, Katarina retracted her gaze and said to Tracy with her melodious voice, "Embrace the afflicted pain, this might be something beneficial for you." She then looked towards Isaac. "I remember that batch of documents. It records the various attempts used by the Balam royalty to revive death, but unfortunately, they seem to fail miserably. Towards the end, they seem to consider creating an artificial death. Are you still interested? An artificial death? How can death be artificial? Apart from a uniqueness and beyonder characteristics, how can there be other methods? It's not like it's something you can find on the street. Was the former Balam Empire and the present Numinous Episcopate all crazy?" Klein mumbled silently and didn't interrupt the conversation between the demigods. Isaac pondered for 2 seconds before asking, "What price do I need to pay?" Katarina smiled youthfully. "No, there's no need. I thought it over. Helping you regain your memories and find your past in order to become the Death Consul from before should be a rather interesting matter. This can bring more changes and fun to this world." Those words sound like a rebellious teenage girl. A demoness of unaging not only doesn't age in body but in mind as well. Klein felt it somewhat impossible to grasp her thought process. Perhaps only a Sequence 6 or 5, or even Sequence 4 of the Spectator pathway can tell. He subconsciously guessed. Isaac nodded and extended his right hand. A piece of paper and a fountain pen in the room automatically flew over as though invisible spirits were at his service. After scribbling, he threw the paper over. "You can summon my messenger. So there's only one copper whistle. For it to remain effective for more than 1,000 years, that copper whistle is definitely no simple item." Klein instinctively wished to reach out to touch Isaac's copper whistle inside his pocket, but he held back. Katarina caught the piece of paper and scanned it before pursing her lips into a smile. "I thought you would have directly told me where in the underworld." She looked up as her blue eyes effused an indescribable warmth as she smiled faintly. "I still remember how Mr. Death Consul from before was such a powerful but cold man. He left a deep impression on me. I'm also curious as to why you would become so soft." Isaac held his fist to his mouth and shook his head with a bitter smile. "I'm immortal, but that doesn't mean I don't age. Once a person ages, they will often become placid." "No." Katarina's eyes flickered deep down as she said without concealing anything, "I look forward to the day you recover all your memories. I wish to see how you would evaluate the present you." Upon saying that, she curled her lips slightly and winked at Klein. "Perhaps we will release an existence more evil than a devil. This is her trying to sow discord, right?" Klein muttered inwardly, but he couldn't help but recall the pale disaster recorded in many historical books and church tomes. It had caused a large number of casualties and had turned the northern continent into a living hell. And this disaster was mainly led by Death and the primordial Demonis, with Death's entourage and the Demonis sect from the southern continent. In this entire matter, Mr. Isaac, who was known as Death Consul, definitely played a rather important role. Isaac fell silent for a few seconds as he grabbed Klein's shoulder and pulled him into the spirit world and traversed it. Instantly, There was only Demoness of Unaging Katarina Pell and Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy left in the Black Death's captain's cabin. The latter looked at the spot where the two had disappeared, and after taking a while to calm herself, she clenched her teeth and said, "I never forget this matter." Katarina resumed her pure demeanor and smiled faintly. Feel the afflicted pain. The more pain you feel, the more you will realize how weak you are. When the pain reaches a threshold, the desire to change yourself will reach a certain intensity, allowing you to withstand the potion and obtain godhood during the ritual to become a demigod. When Tracy heard this, she suddenly thought of something. Her expression froze as she blurted out, "Helene was able to escape the Black Death because of." Katarina smiled mildly. "You are my youngest child, but you are the one who's most promising at becoming a demigod. As a mother, I will naturally want to help you." Tracy's facial muscles twitched as she said with a warped expression, "That's right. I have a mother like you, and a mom. Why didn't you tell me the truth in the beginning? You clearly knew the mid and low sequences of several other pathways." Katarina turned her body as her white gown fluttered. She said ethereally, "We all need to approach the primordial. We are all her children." As she spoke, surging but silent black flames soared over the huge sailboat which was dozens of meters long. The flames covered every corner as they burned silently without injuring any of the pirates on the Black Death, as though they were clearing up any accumulated dust. That stacked colors quickly receded, and the indescribable transparent figure went far into the distance. Klein's spirituality suddenly stirred as he felt that the items he had left on the Black Death had all vanished. As expected of a Demoness of Unaging. Klein sighed. Just as he was about to say something, he felt himself plummet. He had left the spirit world with Azek. He found themselves in a mountain valley with a river flowing. There were fertile fields with a manor and town that was built in a Loanese style. Klein looked around him and discovered that he was standing in a dark cemetery that had long been abandoned. "Mr. Azek." He shouted in puzzlement. Azek walked to a grave with a broken tombstone that was covered in weeds. He said solemnly, "After meeting Katarina Pell, I recalled some matters again. I once told you that in a particular dream, in one of my lives, I had a daughter. She had soft black hair and enjoyed sitting in a swing I made myself while requesting sweets from me. When traversing the spirit world, I suddenly sensed the call of my bloodline." Klein was infected with his emotions as he asked solemnly, "Is this her?" Azek nodded and crouched down. He touched the halved tombstone as his bronze face wore a gentle, sorrowful, and confused look. "This is her grave. If I recall correctly, she's been dead for 926 years. 926 years. Klein wanted to say something, but he was stopped by that extended period of time. If it wasn't for the churches compelling people to be buried in cemeteries and providing a certain degree of surveillance, it would have been hard to find this grave and tombstone, since there hadn't been any all-out wars since the Fifth Epoch. A human's life was on the order of decades, but this was 926 years. After a long moment of silence in the cemetery, Azek got up again and grabbed Klein's shoulder. "I'll send you back first." After a few minutes of traversing the spirit world, Klein saw the white bed sheets and yellowish-brown floorboards. Azek pressed down on his hat and said in a deep voice, "I'll continue my journey while you continue on your adventures." Klein nodded. Just as he was about to say something, he saw Mr. Azek curl his lips and smile. "Were you afraid that I would become an evil person like a demoness after fully recovering my memories?" Before Klein could reply, Azek sighed. "I'm also very worried. But, I have a greater desire for discovering myself." After saying that, the surrounding aqueous void around him rippled as he vanished from the room. For a long period of time, Klein stood in his spot, silent. He shook his head and laughed silently as he consoled himself, "Perhaps when the time comes, I'll already be a powerhouse at the level of Angel. I can establish a treatment facility that treats antisocial personalities and have Miss Justice be the head doctor." Retracting his thoughts, Klein sat down and habitually reflected over his operation. I originally thought that I could graze a demoness of affliction and obtain Death's Chronicles while making further progress in the human disappearances. Who knew that the development and outcome were completely out of my expectations? I only managed to complete the initial goals. Sigh, I cannot incite Mr. Azek to take action since he hasn't completely recovered. Furthermore, the person we were facing was a demoness of unaging. What's most important is to be strong myself. Relying on myself is better than asking for help from others. On careful consideration, I do rely on myself most of the time. I can attack the human disappearance cases from the angle of the buyer, that crazy Captain Connors Victor. Klein changed his sitting posture and nodded to himself as he murmured inwardly, the greatest gain that I received was to establish the preliminary acting principles of a faceless. It's to get into character and be detached, overcome any aversions, and to be careful about being too immersed in the role. This way, by relying only on simple, ordinary, real acting, perhaps it will take a year or two to digest the potion. But for me, I should be able to fully digest it in about 4 to 6 months. After reflecting on the matter, Klein prepared to sleep. He planned on taking down the radio transceiver from above the gray fog once it was daybreak, so as to establish communications with the magic mirror, Rhodes. Of course, he had to first divine the level of danger above the gray fog. Early in the morning, above the gray fog. Klein conjured a pen and paper as he deliberated over the divination statement, using the radio transceiver is dangerous. After carefully checking the statement twice, he took out the spirit pendulum under his left sleeve and began divining. During this process, he was on high alert and was somewhat afraid. He was like a child covering his ears while lighting firecrackers. If the outcome would involve the true creator or the primordial demoness, then he would encounter danger simply from divining it. If it were any other person, they would only end up losing control or dying. However, Klein had the gray fog to shield him and prevent him from having such a tragic outcome. Hence, it was obvious that anything that happened above the gray fog was better than courting death in the real world. He was afraid that the using it repeatedly would allow the evil gods to lock onto him and personally pay him a visit. He quickly entered the state of cogitation and silently recited the divination. After chanting 7 times, he knew the answer without opening his eyes, since he was completely fine sitting there in his seat and wasn't suffering from any extreme pain. When Klein looked at the dangling topaz, he discovered that it was indeed spinning counterclockwise. Phew! Klein heaved a sigh of relief and immediately returned to the real world and began preparing a ritual to bring the radio transceiver from above the gray fog to the real world. After about half an hour, he finally heard the radio transceiver produce its clickety-clack. An illusory piece of white paper was spat out with lines of Loanese words written on it. I'm here. Great Master, is that you? Why does it feel like it's craning its neck? Klein suddenly recalled the emoticons from his previous life. It was an adorable alpaca that craned its neck out. He took 2 steps forward and tersely answered in a reserved manner. Amidst clicking sounds, more illusory paper was spat out, your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, at your service. Klein hid his discomfort in the depths of his heart and asked, Rhodes, tell me. Where is Roy King from the Life School of Thought? Due to the chubby apothecary's description, he knew that the organization developed itself based on a master and apprentice system. He inferred that they grasped the 2 beyonder pathways of monster and apothecary. This matched the characteristics of the Life School of Thought. Meanwhile, Klein prepared Roy King's picture, with the intention of relying on himself rather than on others. The tapping sounds intensified as Rhodes produced a portrait with the radio transceiver. It was none other than Roy King with his hair neatly combed back while wearing a framed pair of glasses. Is this him? A line of Loanese appeared behind the portrait. Klein nodded. Yes. Rhodes made the radio transceiver's tapping sound turn abnormally brisk. Great Master, the person you wish to find is imprisoned in the Governor General's office of the City of Generosity, Byam. Locked in the Governor General's office? Klein frowned slightly and wasn't in a rush to continue asking. He said with confidence and frankness, "All right, according to your rules, it's your turn to ask." Tap. 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 Rhodes used the radio transceiver to produce a smiley face and a line of text. "I've already asked, and you have already answered." When did that happen? Klein was taken aback before looking at the content before the illusory piece of paper. He saw the previous question, "Is it him?" This works. That actually counts. In that instant, Klein finally understood how much freedom Rhodes had to its rules. Against any ordinary person, it could be as strict and vile as it wanted. It even needed spectators, but when it came to Klein, those rules were ignored, and he blatantly made it easy. How did this guy adopt such a personality? Klein considered for 2 seconds before asking another question. "Rhodes, do you know the book, Grosel's Travels?" Rhodes fell silent for 2 seconds before making the radio transceiver type. It spat out more illusory paper. "Great master, your question is too nice for me. All I needed to do was answer, yes, to be done with the question. I've modified the question a little, changing it to, tell me what you know about Grosel's Travels. This is a very magical book. Many of its owners have vanished. I'm unable to tell who its creator is, but I'm certain that it first appeared among the dragons, after the disappearance of the City of Miracles, Liveseed. It appeared after the City of Miracles, Liveseed, which was conjured by the Dragon of Imagination, Ankwelt. I might be able to recommend this to Miss Justice. She might be interested. If she really wishes to buy it, as a middleman, I can study it ahead of time above the grey fog. If something bad happens from the study, resulting in the complete destruction of the book, I can tell her that the seller went back on their word and a refund was made. Thinking of this, being a platform is really promising." Klein's thoughts raced as he said to the radio transceiver, "It's your turn. I do want to know what kind of odd question you can ask." Klein thought silently. Rhodes didn't pause as he produced a line in Loanese, "Great master, I've already asked and you have already answered." When did that happen? Klein looked in confusion and amusement at the first few pages of illusory paper before finally seeing the so-called question at the beginning, "Great master, is that you?" I have to say that this magic mirror named Rhodes really shows no shame when it tries to suck up to me. However, such a paired question format really satisfies an OCD. It's like the AND operator back when I studied programming languages myself. Klein cleared his throat and continued asking, "Why was Roy King imprisoned in the Governor General's office?" The radio transceiver produced its clickety-clack and spat out illusory paper. Ever since the disappearance of the Snake of Mercury from the Life School of Thought, the organization fractured and encountered plenty of danger. Some even died at the hands of the Rose School of Thought. The Life School of Thought developed in a secretive manner with the master and apprentice format, but they have an elder council among the upper echelons. They harmonize the conflicts between the different internal factions. Since the fifth epoch, the Elder Council changed to a more trendy name known as the Fate Council. There are 7 counselors, and the Snake of Mercury is the president. Roy King's teacher is one of the Fate counselors and had got into trouble after the Snake of Mercury's disappearance. And before this, he had handed an important sealed artifact of the Life School of Thought to Roy King. This is the reason why Roy King was secretly captured by the lone military. The disappearance of the Snake of Mercury? Klein instantly made the connection to Wuxia, who was hiding in Backland, as well as the other Snake of Mercury that had been pursuing him without ever showing its face. Klein suspected the other Snake of Mercury to be Angel of Fate, Ouroboros. The Life School of Thought Snake of Mercury is definitely not the one searching for Wuxia, as he has had plenty of opportunities to contact his organization and not be missing. Perhaps it's Wuxia or a third snake. This cannot be determined. Klein gently nodded and said to the radio transceiver, "Ask. I'm sure you haven't asked me any other questions." Let's see what you'll ask." I have to say, people have a little bit of masochism in them. Others are afraid of Rhodes's questions, but it has already waved off 2 questions for me. Now, I do wish for it to formally ask me a question. Klein waited with piqued interest. Tap. 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 The radio transceiver's sounds suddenly became somewhat solemn as the illusory piece of paper spat out with increasing difficulty. Well, great master, what should I do to be a better, loyal, and humble servant? I've underestimated your bottom line. Klein restrained his exasperated expression as he replied in a deep voice, just maintain your present state. All right, the tapping sounds became lighter again. The aura is about to disperse. Your loyal and humble servant, Barodes, awaits to be at your service. Finally, Barodes added a drawing of a hand waving. It's really talented. That's right, it's not hard for a magic mirror that knows so much, to know such things. Klein watched as the radio transceiver turned silent. He took a few steps and sat by the edge of the bed, considering the matter regarding Roy King. He had no intention of infiltrating Byam's Governor General's office and rescuing Roy King under the military's tight security. This was because he didn't know the man at all, and he hadn't even seen him before. The only connection they had was through the chubby apothecary. The basement of the Church of Storms definitely has many Beyonders locked up there. But what has that got to do with me? Klein chuckled as he shook his head. In the information provided to him by Rhodes, Klein noticed that the mystical item which Admiral of Blood Senior had, which made him sufficiently lucky, came from the life school of thought. There was a high probability that the faction backing this pirate admiral was the Rose School of Thought. They were taking advantage of the Snake of Mercury's disappearance, so they could kill members of the life school of thought. This also reminds me that I need to be more careful than before when dealing with pirate admirals. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy had gotten Demonis of unaging Katarina Pell without any notice. The other pirate admirals wouldn't be without their supporters. They often represent a faction, an organization. Admiral of Blood is backed by the Rose School of Thought, while Admiral of Stars is backed by the Moses Ascetic Order, as well as for our Tarot Club. The backer of Admiral Hell is likely the Numinous Episcopate and the King of the Five Seas. As for Vice Admiral Iceberg, she's likely backed by the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. The backers for Vice Admiral Deep Sea and Vice Admiral Dusk are currently unknown, but it's definitely impossible that they relied solely on themselves to reign supreme over the seas for so many years. Now on second thought, which faction was backing Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos? The one that gave him creeping hunger, or the unspeakable organization that instigated him to assassinate Duke Negan? Yes, I must be careful not to expose my intention of hunting pirate admirals in the future. Furthermore, I can only make one attempt and immediately distance myself if I fail. As Klein's thoughts varied, he suddenly thought of something. The paper crane that was personally folded by that Snake of Mercury, Will Oseptin, was still with him.